The November wind rattled the windows of Marcus Williams' small brick house on Detroit's east side, carrying with it the familiar scent of autumn decay and the distant hum of traffic on 8 Mile Road. At 64, Marcus had grown accustomed to the quiet rhythms of retirement, morning coffee at exactly 6:30 a.m., the Detroit Free Press spread across his kitchen table, and the gentle companionship of his aging tabby cat, Motown. But on this particular Tuesday morning, as frost painted delicate patterns on his kitchen window, the phone rang with an urgency that made his weathered hands tremble as he reached for it. "Hello?" His voice carried the gravelly tone of a man who'd spent 30 years calling out addresses and package deliveries. "Dad?" The voice on the other end was familiar yet strange, like a melody half-remembered from a distant song. Sarah, his daughter. The same Sarah who hadn't spoken to him in nearly 2 years, not since that explosive Christmas dinner when old wounds had been torn open like packages with too much tape. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Sarah never called him Dad anymore. It was always Marcus, delivered with the cold precision of someone addressing a stranger. His coffee grew cold as he pressed the phone closer to his ear, afraid that speaking too loudly might somehow break this fragile connection. "Sarah, baby, is that you?" The endearment slipped out before he could stop it, a relic from when she was small enough to sit on his shoulders and call him the strongest man in the world. "Yes, it's me." Her voice carried an edge he couldn't quite identify. Exhaustion, maybe, or something deeper. "I need to tell you something." The silence stretched between them like the miles that separated Detroit from Seattle, where Sarah had moved after college. Marcus could hear something in the background. Was that crying? A baby crying? "Are you okay? You sound—" "I had a baby, Dad." The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for so long they'd gained their own momentum. "A son. He was born yesterday." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Marcus gripped the edge of his Formica kitchen table, the same table where Sarah had done her homework 25 years ago, where they'd shared countless meals before everything went wrong. A grandson. He was a grandfather. "Sarah, that's wonderful. Congratulations, baby. And you'll never meet him." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs. Outside, a garbage truck rumbled past, its hydraulic whine mixing with the sudden ringing in his ears. Marcus sank into his chair, the vinyl squeaking under his weight. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." Sarah's voice hardened, each word carefully measured. "You gave up the right to be a grandfather, the same day you gave up being a father. Sarah, please, don't do this, not now. We can talk about—" "About what, Dad? About how you chose work over me, about how you missed every school play, every basketball game, every moment that mattered, about how you let Mom handle everything while you hid behind double shifts and overtime." Marcus closed his eyes, seeing his daughter at 16, standing in this same kitchen with tears streaming down her face as she begged him to come to her graduation ceremony. He'd had a route to cover that day. Jerry was out sick, and the supervisor had specifically asked for him. Important packages, he'd told her, people counting on him. "I was trying to provide for you, for both of you. Your mother understood. Mom died understanding that you never chose us first." Sarah's voice cracked, and Marcus heard the baby crying louder now in the background. "She died waiting for you to come home from a job that meant more to you than your own family." The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Marcus remembered the call from Detroit General Hospital, how he'd rushed from his route to find Elena in the ICU, machines beeping around her like some terrible electronic symphony. She'd lived for 3 more days, and he'd sat beside her bed holding her hand and making promises he was already too late to keep. "That's not fair, Sarah. You know I loved your mother. I loved you both. Love isn't just a feeling, Dad. It's a choice." Every single day it's a choice, and you chose wrong every time. Through the phone, Marcus heard a man's voice, gentle, soothing, talking to Sarah in the background. Her husband, probably. The man who'd been there for the birth of Marcus's grandson, who'd get to hold that baby and watch him take his first steps and teach him to ride a bicycle. All the things Marcus had missed with Sarah and would now miss with her son. "What's his name?" Marcus asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. The silence stretched so long he thought she might have hung up. "David," she finally said. "David Marcus Coleman." Marcus. She'd given the baby his name as a middle name. Despite everything, despite the years of silence and hurt, some part of his daughter still carried love for him. The realization broke something open in his chest. "Sarah, I have to go. David needs to eat." Her voice was softer now, tired. I thought you should know he exists. But that's all you get to know." "Wait, please. Can we talk about this? I know I made mistakes, but goodbye, Dad." The line went dead, leaving Marcus staring at the phone in his hand as if it might somehow bring his daughter's voice back. Outside, Detroit continued its daily rhythm. Cars honking, neighbors calling to each other, the world moving forward, while his seemed to have stopped completely. He set the phone down with shaking hands and looked around his kitchen. The walls were covered with photographs, pictures of Sarah as a child, school portraits with gap-toothed smiles, a few family photos from better times. But there were gaps too, spaces where pictures should have been, but weren't. Graduation photos he'd missed taking, birthday parties he'd worked through, Christmas mornings abbreviated because he had to cover someone else's route. The coffee maker gurgled to life for its second pot of the day, an automatic routine that felt suddenly meaningless. Marcus pulled out his chair and sat heavily, his 64-year-old knees protesting. When had he gotten so old? When had the strong man who could lift Sarah above his head become this stranger with grey stubble and arthritic hands? Motown wandered into the kitchen, tail swishing, and rubbed against Marcus's legs with the persistent affection of a creature who'd never been disappointed by promises of attention that never came. Marcus reached down and scratched behind the cat's ears, grateful for the simple, uncomplicated love of an animal who asked for nothing more than food and warmth. "What do you think, old friend?" he asked the cat. "Think I screwed up too bad to fix?" Motown purred, which Marcus chose to interpret as optimism. The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Marcus thought about Sarah's words, each one echoing in his memory with the precision of someone who'd been rehearsing this conversation for years. He thought about Elena, how she used to make excuses for his absences at school events, how she'd take pictures to show him later, how she'd gradually stopped asking him to come home early for dinner. He thought about David, his grandson, a baby he'd never seen, whose face he'd never know. A continuation of the Williams family line that would grow up without knowing where he came from, without the stories Marcus could tell about his own father, who'd worked the assembly line at Ford and taught Marcus about the dignity of honest work. But mostly he thought about choices. Sarah had been right about that. Love was a choice, made new each day. And for too many days, for too many years, he'd chosen wrong. The phone sat silent on the table, no longer an instrument of communication, but a monument to missed opportunities. Marcus stared at it for a long time, thinking about Seattle, about his daughter trying to raise a child without family support, about the grandson who would never know his grandfather's voice or feel his weathered hands. By noon, he'd made a decision that would have seemed impossible at dawn. Marcus Williams, who hadn't been on an airplane in 15 years, who'd never traveled further west than Chicago, was going to Seattle. He didn't know how Sarah would react, didn't know if she'd even speak to him, but he knew he couldn't live with the silence anymore. He picked up the phone and dialed directory assistance, his hands steadier now with purpose. "Seattle, Washington," he told the operator. "I need the number for Alaska Airlines." UDD, the Detroit Metropolitan Airport, bustled with the controlled chaos of a Tuesday afternoon in late November. Marcus sat in the departure lounge, his single suitcase at his feet and a boarding pass clutched in his hands like a lifeline. Flight 472 to Seattle would depart in 45 minutes, the first airplane ticket he'd purchased in over a decade. Around him, business travelers typed on laptops while families corralled restless children. A young mother bounced a baby who couldn't have been more than a few weeks old, and Marcus found himself studying the infant's tiny features, wondering if his grandson looked anything like that. Dark hair, maybe, like Sarah had as a baby. Or would he have taken after his father? Marcus realized he didn't even know what Sarah's husband looked like. "First time flying?" asked the elderly woman beside him. She had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a cardigan that reminded Marcus of his mother. "No, Mom, just been a while." Marcus managed to smile. "You?" "Oh, heavens, no. I make this trip every few months to see my grandchildren in Portland. 5 of them now, can you believe it?" She pulled out her phone, swiping through photos with the practiced ease of a grandmother who'd mastered technology out of love. "This is little Emma. She just turned 3. And here's Michael. He's starting kindergarten." Marcus nodded politely, each photo a small knife twist in his chest. This woman was living the life he'd forfeited, the relationship he'd lost through his own stubborn pride and misplaced priorities. When she showed him a video of a toddler taking his first steps, Marcus had to excuse himself to use the restroom just to collect himself. In the small airplane bathroom, he splashed water on his face and looked at his reflection in the unforgiving fluorescent light. When had the lines around his eyes gotten so deep? When had his hair gone from salt and pepper to mostly salt? He looked like what he was, an old man traveling across the country to beg his daughter for forgiveness he probably didn't deserve. The flight to Seattle took 4.5 hours, during which Marcus stared out the window at the changing landscape below. Michigan's industrial sprawl gave way to the vast farmland of the Midwest, then to the dramatic peaks of the Rocky Mountains. He'd forgotten how big the country was, how much space existed between one life and another. For 30 years, his world had been contained within the boundaries of his postal route, 68 square blocks of Detroit that he knew better than his own daughter's heart. Somewhere over Montana, Marcus pulled out the letter he'd been writing and rewriting for the past 2 days. It was addressed to Sarah, 8 pages of cramped handwriting on legal pad paper, trying to explain 20 years of mistakes in words that felt inadequate for the task. He'd started over dozens of times, each attempt falling short of the apology he owed her. "Dear Sarah," the current version began. "I know you told me never to contact you, but I couldn't live with the silence anymore. When you told me about David, about my grandson, something broke open in me that I thought had died with your mother." He folded the letter and put it back in his jacket pocket. Words on paper couldn't carry the weight of what he needed to say. If Sarah would listen to him at all, it would have to be face to face, man to daughter, with all the years of hurt laid bare between them. The descent into Seattle revealed a city that seemed to rise from the water itself, all glass and steel towers reflecting the grey November sky. Mount Rainier loomed in the distance, snow-capped and majestic, indifferent to the human dramas playing out in its shadow. Marcus had never seen mountains like this. Detroit was flat as a table, urban sprawl spreading in every direction without obstruction. At baggage claim, he waited for his suitcase and tried to plan what he'd say when he knocked on Sarah's door. Would she slam it in his face? Call the police? Or would she be too tired too overwhelmed with a newborn baby to do anything but let him in out of sheer exhaustion. The taxi driver was a Somali immigrant named Abdi, who made polite conversation about the weather and the traffic while navigating the unfamiliar streets. Marcus gave him the address he'd found through directory assistance, watching the city change as they drove north toward the Ballard neighborhood where Sarah lived. The industrial areas near the airport gave way to tree-lined residential streets, modest houses with well-tended gardens, the kind of middle-class neighborhood where people pushed strollers and walked dogs and lived the quiet domestic lives Marcus had been too busy to appreciate when he'd had the chance. "This is good area," Abdi said, as they pulled up in front of a blue craftsman bungalow with a small front porch. "Family neighborhood, safe for children." Marcus paid the fare and stood on the sidewalk with his suitcase, looking at the house where his daughter lived. There were toys in the yard, a small tricycle, some plastic buckets, evidence of the life she'd built without him. The front window glowed with warm yellow light, and he could see the flicker of what might have been a television. Normal, domestic, peaceful. Everything he'd missed while chasing overtime pay and supervisor approval. The November air in Seattle felt different from Detroit, cleaner somehow, touched with the salt of Puget Sound and the green scent of the evergreen trees that seemed to grow everywhere. It was past 7 o'clock, dark except for the streetlights and the glow from windows. In Detroit, Marcus would be settling in for the evening news, heating up a frozen dinner, preparing for another night of solitary routine. He walked up the front path, his footsteps loud on the wooden porch steps. The doorbell was a simple button beside a dark green door with a wreath that looked handmade, probably something Sarah had crafted during her maternity leave. His finger hesitated over the button. Once he pressed it, there would be no going back. Whatever happened next would determine whether he spent the rest of his life as a grandfather or as a stranger to his own blood. Through the door, he could hear the sound of a television, maybe voices talking quietly. A baby cried, brief, quickly soothed. His grandson, David Marcus Coleman, 3 days old, probably hungry or needing to be changed. Marcus pressed the doorbell. The sound was melodic, two-toned, civilized. Detroit doorbells were harsh buzzes or sharp dings, utilitarian sounds for a utilitarian city. This was the kind of doorbell you'd find in a neighborhood where people knew each other's names and borrowed cups of sugar. Footsteps approached, quick, light. Sarah's footsteps, though heavier than he remembered. The porch light came on, flooding him with sudden brightness that made him squint. He heard the sound of deadbolts being turned, a security chain being unhooked. The door opened, and there was his daughter. Sarah looked exactly as he'd imagined, and nothing like he'd expected. She was older, of course, 32 now, a woman instead of the girl who'd stormed out of his house that Christmas Eve. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy ponytail, and she wore sweatpants and an oversized flannel shirt that probably belonged to her husband. She looked tired, the way new mothers always looked tired, with dark circles under eyes that were still the same warm brown they'd been when she was 5 years old and thought he could fix anything. But it was the expression on her face that nearly broke him. Not anger, not the fury he'd expected, just a kind of weary resignation, as if she'd always known this moment would come and had been dreading it for years. Dad. Not a question. Just an acknowledgement, flat and emotionless. "Hello, baby." The words came out rougher than he'd intended, thick with the emotion he'd been holding back during the 5-hour journey. "I know you said... How did you find my address?" "Directory assistance." It wasn't hard. Sarah nodded, as if she'd expected this. She didn't invite him in, didn't step aside to make room. They stood there in the doorway, father and daughter, with 20 years of hurt between them and a new baby crying somewhere in the house behind her. "You can't stay," she said quietly. "I meant what I said on the phone." "I know, but I had to come, I had to try." "Try what exactly?" To fix 20 years of neglect with a surprise visit? To meet my son so you can disappoint him the way you disappointed me? The words hit him like physical blows, each one accurate and devastating. Marcus set his suitcase down on the porch and looked at his daughter. Really looked at her, maybe for the first time in years. She was stronger than he remembered, or maybe she'd just learned to armor herself against disappointment. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," he said. "I know I made mistakes. But Sarah, honey, I'm asking you not to make my mistakes your own." What's that supposed to mean? It means that cutting people out of your life feels like justice, but it might just be another kind of mistake. Your grandmother never spoke to my father for the last 10 years of his life. Some argument I can't even remember now, and when he died, she regretted it every day until she followed him. Sarah's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in her eyes. Uncertainty, maybe, or just exhaustion. Behind her, the baby's crying grew more insistent. "David needs me," she said. "I know, but maybe he could use a grandfather too. Maybe not now, but someday." You had your chance to be a grandfather. You had your chance to be a father. You chose work instead. "You're right. I did, and I'll regret it until the day I die." Marcus felt tears threatening and didn't try to stop them. "But that baby in there, he didn't make those choices. Don't punish him for my mistakes." For a moment Sarah wavered. Marcus could see it in the way she glanced back toward the house, toward her son, but then her jaw tightened, and the moment passed. "Go home, Dad. There's nothing for you here." She started to close the door, but Marcus put his hand against it gently. "Sarah, wait. Please, just let me tell you about your grandfather, my father, David's great-grandfather. Let me tell you the stories I should have told you years ago." "Stories won't fix this." "Maybe not, but maybe they'll help you understand that family isn't just about the mistakes we make. It's about the love that survives those mistakes." The baby's crying stopped suddenly, and in the silence that followed, Marcus could hear a man's voice inside the house, soothing and gentle. Sarah's husband, probably feeding or changing David, the intimate sounds of a family taking care of each other. "5 minutes, Sarah said finally. "You can sit on the porch and tell me about your father. 5 minutes, and then you leave, and you don't come back." She stepped outside and closed the door behind her, wrapping her arms around herself against the November cold. Marcus sat down on the porch steps, and after a moment she joined him, keeping careful distance between them. The Seattle night was quiet, except for the distant sound of traffic and the rustle of wind through the evergreen trees. Marcus looked at his daughter's profile in the porch light and began to speak. "Your grandfather," Marcus began, his voice soft in the November night, "was a man who believed in showing up every day, no matter what." Sarah pulled her flannel shirt tighter around herself, her breath visible in small clouds as she stared straight ahead. She didn't look at him, but she didn't get up either, and Marcus took that as permission to continue. "David Williams, that's who your son is named after, really, not me. My father. Your grandfather worked the assembly line at the River Rouge plant for 38 years. Never missed a day, unless he was in the hospital, and even then, he tried to go in with a broken arm once." Marcus could see his father as clearly as if the man were sitting beside them, tall and lean, with hands that were always stained with motor oil and a laugh that could fill a room. David Williams had died when Sarah was only 3, too young to remember him, another loss Marcus had never properly mourned or explained. "He used to tell me that a man's word was the only currency that really mattered, that if you said you'd be somewhere, you better be there. If you promise something, you better deliver." Marcus paused, the irony not lost on him. "I thought I was following his example, working all those extra hours, providing for you and your mother, but I got it backwards." Sarah shifted slightly, and Marcus caught a glimpse of her expression, guarded but listening. Your grandfather never missed my baseball games. Not one, Sarah. He worked the night shift for 2 years, just so he could be there for my Saturday morning games. Sat in those aluminum bleachers at Lincoln Park, cheering for a kid who couldn't hit a curveball to save his life. Why are you telling me this? Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper. Because you need to know where you come from. Because David, your David, deserves to know his history. And because maybe understanding my father will help you understand how I got it so wrong. Through the window behind them, Marcus could see shadows moving inside the house. Sarah's husband, probably, walking the baby, doing the things Marcus should have done 30 years ago, the things he'd been too busy to learn, too proud to ask about. Your grandfather had rules, Marcus continued. Family dinner every Sunday, no exceptions. Nobody worked on their birthday. That was a day for celebration, not labor. And every Friday night, we'd sit on the front porch, no matter what the weather, and he'd tell me stories about his own father, about the family that came before us. Sarah turned to look at him then, for the first time since she'd stepped outside. You never told me any of this. I know. I thought there'd be time later. I thought work came first, and family would always be there waiting. Marcus felt the familiar weight of regret, heavy as a sack of mail on his shoulders. Your grandfather would have been ashamed of me, Sarah, ashamed of how I prioritized everything over the people who mattered most. The night air carried the sound of a train whistle somewhere in the distance, lonesome and clear. Seattle was a port city, Marcus realized, a place where people came and went, where families were separated by water and reunited by bridges. Not like Detroit, where generations stayed put, where families lived and died in the same neighborhoods, accumulating history like sediment. He taught me to fish, Marcus said, the memory surfacing like something long submerged. Every Saturday morning in the summer, we'd drive out to Lake Huron with a thermos of coffee and a cooler full of sandwiches your grandmother had made. We'd sit in that old aluminum boat for hours, sometimes not catching anything, just talking. About what? Everything. Work, dreams, girls I liked, troubles at school. He was a good listener, your grandfather. Never judged, never gave advice unless I asked for it. Just listened and nodded and threw his line back in the water. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Marcus could see her processing this information, trying to fit it into her understanding of the family she'd grown up in. He remembered her at 12, asking why they never went camping or took vacations like other families. He'd told her they couldn't afford it, but the truth was, he'd been too busy, too focused on advancement and recognition to prioritize making memories. I took you fishing once, Marcus said. Do you remember? You were maybe 6 or 7. We went to Belle Isle, rented one of those little rowboats. Sarah nodded slowly. I remember. I caught a bluegill, and you helped me take it off the hook. It was so small we threw it back. You cried when we released it, said you wanted to keep it as a pet. I thought all fish were like goldfish. I didn't understand that some belonged in the wild. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both remembering that long ago afternoon. It had been one of the good days, Marcus realized, one of the times when he'd gotten it right. But there had been too few of those days, and too many evenings when he'd come home after Sarah was already asleep, too many weekends when he'd chosen overtime over family time. Your grandfather died on a Tuesday, Marcus said. Heart attack at the plant. Went quick, they said. 1 minute he was tightening bolts on a chassis, the next he was gone. Sarah's hand moved slightly as if she might reach for his, but then she stopped herself. The whole neighborhood came to the funeral. People I'd never seen before, men who'd worked beside him for decades, families he'd helped in ways I never knew about. That's when I realized how much I didn't know about my own father, how little attention I'd paid to the man he really was outside of work. Marcus could see the funeral as clearly as if it had happened yesterday. The packed church, the line of mourners that stretched around the block, his mother in her black dress, accepting condolences with quiet dignity. He'd been 28 then, already married to Elena, already starting to make the same mistakes he'd sworn he'd never make. He left me his tools, Marcus continued. This big red toolbox full of wrenches and screwdrivers and things I didn't even know the names of. I kept thinking I'd learn to use them someday, maybe build something with my hands the way he did. But I never found the time. Do you still have them? In the garage, covered with dust, but still there. Marcus looked at his daughter in the porch light, seeing so much of Elena in her features, but something of his father too. The stubborn set of her jaw, the way she held herself straight, even when she was tired. I'd like David to have them someday, when he's old enough, along with the stories. Sarah stood up abruptly, wrapping her arms around herself. You can't just show up here with stories and think it changes everything. You can't just decide to be a father, a grandfather, because it's convenient now. I know that. But Sarah, I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm asking you to consider what might happen next. Your son is going to have questions someday about his family, about where he comes from. Wouldn't it be better if he could get those answers from someone who loves him? He has a family. He has me and Tom's parents, but he doesn't have his grandfather's stories. He doesn't have the fishing trips and the Sunday dinners and the Friday night talks on the porch. He doesn't have the history that connects him to something bigger than himself. Sarah turned away, looking out at the quiet street where her neighbors lived their orderly lives. Marcus could see the struggle in her posture, the war between the hurt she'd carried for so long and the hope that maybe, somehow, things could be different. I don't know how to forgive you, she said finally, her voice small in the darkness. I don't need you to forgive me tonight. I just need you to think about it. Think about whether holding on to this anger is serving you or serving David. The front door opened, and a man appeared, tall with sandy hair and wire-rimmed glasses, holding a sleeping baby against his shoulder. Sarah's husband, Tom. He looked tired, but content, the way fathers look when they're successfully managing the impossible logistics of new parenthood. Sarah, everything okay out here? His voice was gentle, concerned but not intrusive. He glanced at Marcus with curiosity rather than hostility, which suggested Sarah hadn't painted him as a complete villain. Tom, this is my father. Marcus. Sarah's voice was carefully neutral. Dad, this is my husband, Tom Coleman. Marcus stood, extending his hand. Pleased to meet you, son. I'm sorry to intrude on your evening. Tom shifted the baby to one arm and shook Marcus's hand with genuine warmth. Not an intrusion at all. Sarah's told me a lot about you. Marcus winced slightly, imagining what those stories might have contained. Is this David? Marcus asked, his voice soft with wonder. Tom looked at Sarah, who nodded almost imperceptibly. David Marcus Coleman, Tom said with obvious pride. Born Sunday afternoon, 7 pounds, 2 ounces. Perfect 10 fingers and 10 toes. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he looked at his grandson for the first time. The baby was tiny, impossibly small, with a shock of dark hair and skin that glowed golden in the porch light. His little fist was curled against Tom's shoulder, and even in sleep, Marcus could see the resemblance to Sarah as a newborn, to Eleanor, to generations of family stretching back through time. He's beautiful, Marcus whispered. Absolutely beautiful. Would you like to hold him? Tom asked, and both Marcus and Sarah looked at him in surprise. Tom, Sarah started. He's his grandfather, Sarah, and David should know his grandfather's touch, even if it's just this once. Marcus felt tears threatening as Tom carefully transferred the sleeping baby to his arms. David was warm and solid, real in a way that photographs and phone calls could never be. The baby stirred slightly, made a small sound, but didn't wake. Marcus looked down at his grandson and saw the future, first steps and first words, birthday parties and Christmas mornings, all the moments he might miss if Sarah couldn't find a way to forgive him. "Hello, little man," Marcus whispered. "I'm your grandpa. I know you don't know me yet, but I love you already." Sarah watched this exchange with tears streaming down her face, her carefully maintained composure finally cracking. Tom put his arm around her, and the three adults stood there in the Seattle night, connected by this small, sleeping person who carried all their hopes and fears and complicated histories. After a few minutes, Marcus reluctantly handed David back to Tom. The baby settled immediately against his father's shoulder, trusting and content. Marcus wiped his eyes, not caring who saw his tears. "Thank you," he said to Tom. "That means more to me than you can know." Tom nodded. "Maybe you'd like to come inside for some coffee. It's getting cold out here, and Sarah could probably use some help figuring out the logistics of entertaining a newborn and unexpected company." Sarah looked at her husband with gratitude and something that might have been love for his graceful handling of an impossible situation. Then she looked at Marcus, and for the first time since he'd arrived, her expression wasn't entirely guarded. "One cup of coffee," she said. "And then we need to talk about what happens next." Marcus picked up his suitcase and followed his daughter and her family into the house, stepping across a threshold he'd thought might be closed to him forever. The inside of Sarah's house was exactly what Marcus had imagined, and nothing like he'd expected. It was warm and lived in, with soft lighting and furniture that looked comfortable rather than expensive. Baby gear was scattered throughout the living room, a bouncy seat, a basket of tiny clothes waiting to be folded, receiving blankets draped over the back of the couch. The smell of recent meals lingered in the air, along with the sweet, clean scent of a newborn. Tom settled David into a bassinet beside the couch, while Sarah moved to the kitchen, putting on a pot of coffee with the automatic efficiency of someone who'd been surviving on caffeine for the past 3 days. Marcus stood awkwardly in the doorway, unsure of the protocol for estranged fathers visiting their daughters' homes. "You can sit down, Dad," Sarah said without turning around. "The couch doesn't bite." Marcus settled himself carefully on the edge of the sofa, close enough to see David sleeping in his bassinet. The baby's chest rose and fell with perfect rhythm, and occasionally he'd make small sounds, or his fingers would twitch as if he were dreaming about something infinitely important. "He looks like you did as a baby," Marcus said softly. "Same hair, same peaceful expression when you slept." Sarah brought him a mug of coffee, black, the way he'd always drunk it, and settled into the chair across from him. Tom took the other end of the couch, close enough to reach the baby if needed, but giving father and daughter space to navigate their complicated reunion. "I kept some of your baby pictures," Sarah said, "in case David ever wanted to see what his grandfather looked like as a child." The admission surprised Marcus. Despite all her anger, despite 20 years of hurt feelings, Sarah had preserved some connection to their shared history. It gave him hope that maybe this bridge could be rebuilt, even if it took time and patience and more humility than he'd ever been comfortable with. "I have pictures too," Marcus said, "of you, of your mother, of my parents. Stories to go with all of them, if you ever want to hear them." They sipped their coffee in companionable silence, watching David sleep. Marcus found himself cataloguing details to remember: the way the baby's hair stuck up in impossible directions, the tiny fingernails that were already perfectly formed, the way he seemed to find peace in his parents' presence. "Tell me about Tom," Marcus said eventually. "How you met, what he does, all the things I should have asked years ago." Sarah glanced at her husband, and Marcus caught a look of such tenderness between them that it made his chest tighten. This was what he'd wanted for his daughter, someone who loved her completely, who would be the kind of partner Marcus hadn't always been to Elena. "We met in graduate school," Tom said, "both getting our masters in social work at the University of Washington. Sarah was the smartest person in our policy analysis class, and I kept asking her to study with me, even though she didn't need the help." He was persistent, Sarah added, and there was warmth in her voice that Marcus hadn't heard since she was a teenager. "Took him 3 months to get me to go on an actual date. I'm a patient man," Tom said with a smile. "Good thing, considering what I married into." The comment could have been cutting, but Tom's tone was gentle, teasing, and Sarah smiled despite herself. Marcus could see how much his daughter had healed with this man, how she'd learned to trust again after growing up in a house where promises were often broken for the sake of work schedules. "What kind of social work do you do?" Marcus asked. "Family reunification," Tom said, and the irony wasn't lost on any of them. "I work with Child Protective Services, helping families get back together when circumstances allow it, teaching parenting skills, connecting people with resources, that sort of thing." Marcus nodded slowly, understanding now why Tom had encouraged Sarah to let him hold David, why he'd invited him inside. This was a man who'd seen firsthand how families could break apart and come back together, who understood that children needed their histories, even the complicated ones. "It must be difficult work," Marcus said. "Sometimes, but also hopeful. You'd be amazed how much people can change when they're motivated by love for their children." Tom glanced meaningfully at Marcus. "Even when they've made serious mistakes, even when trust has been broken, people can learn to do better." Sarah stood up abruptly, walking to the window that looked out onto the street. "It's not that simple, Tom. Some mistakes are too big to fix with good intentions." "I know that," Tom said gently, "but holding on to anger hurts you more than it hurts the person you're angry at, and now it might hurt David too." "Don't!" Sarah's voice was sharp. "Don't make this about David. Don't make me the bad guy for protecting my son from disappointment." Marcus set down his coffee and looked at his daughter's rigid posture by the window. "Sarah, I know you're protecting him. I know you're doing what you think is best. But maybe you could let me try to earn the right to be part of his life." "How?" She turned around, and Marcus could see the tears she was fighting. "How do I trust you with my son when you couldn't be trusted with me?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus had been asking himself the same thing for 3 days, ever since that phone call that had turned his world upside down. How could he prove he'd changed when the evidence of his failures was sitting right there in front of him, 32 years old, and still wounded by his choices? "I don't know," he said honestly. "I don't know how to undo 20 years of putting work before family. I don't know how to prove I've learned from my mistakes when the damage is already done. But Sarah, I know I can't live with the silence anymore." David stirred in his bassinet, making small sounds that suggested he was waking up. Tom moved to check on him, lifting the baby with the practiced ease of a new father who was already learning his son's rhythms. "He's probably hungry," Sarah said, moving toward Tom. "It's been almost 3 hours." "I can make a bottle," Tom offered. "No, I've got it. The doctor said breastfeeding is better for his immune system." Marcus watched his daughter take her son, saw the natural way she cradled him against her shoulder, the instinctive swaying motion that mothers seem to be born knowing. She was good at this, he realized, confident and gentle and completely focused on David's needs, everything Marcus hadn't been when she was small. "I missed this with you," he said quietly. "All of it. The late-night feedings, the diaper changes, the way you'd fall asleep on my shoulder. Your mother did everything while I worked doubles and told myself I was providing for you." Sarah looked at him over David's head. "I used to wait up for you. When I was little, I'd sit by the front window and watch for your mail truck to come down the street. Mom would tell me you were working late, but I thought maybe if I waited long enough, you'd come home in time to read me a story." The words were like knives, each one cutting deeper than the last. Marcus remembered those days, how he'd come home to find Sarah asleep on the couch by the window, still in her school clothes, a book open beside her. Elena would carry her to bed while Marcus heated up his dinner and watched the late news, too tired to think about what his daughter's vigil might have meant. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words felt inadequate for the weight of what he was apologizing for. "I'm so sorry, baby. I thought I was being a good father by working hard, but I was just being absent." Sarah settled into the rocking chair by the window, positioning David for nursing. The baby latched on immediately, content and trusting, and Sarah's expression softened as she looked down at him. "When I was pregnant," she said slowly, "I kept thinking about what kind of parent I wanted to be, what I wanted to do differently. And I realized that everything I planned was the opposite of what you did." Marcus nodded, understanding. "You're already a better parent than I ever was. But that's not enough, is it? Being better than the example I was given doesn't make me perfect. And maybe keeping David from knowing his grandfather isn't making him safer. Maybe it's just making his world smaller." Tom sat back down on the couch, close enough to watch his wife and son, but giving them space for this intimate moment. Marcus could see how much he loved them both, how he'd probably been gently encouraging Sarah toward this conversation for months. "What are you saying?" Marcus asked carefully. Sarah was quiet for a long time, focusing on David's nursing. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with tears. "I'm saying that maybe I'm tired of being angry. Maybe I'm tired of carrying this hurt around like a stone in my chest, but I don't know how to let it go." "You don't have to let it go all at once," Marcus said. "Maybe we could start small. Phone calls, letters. Let me tell you about David's great-grandfather, about the family stories that belong to him too. And if you disappoint him the way you disappointed me, then I'll have to live with that. But Sarah, I'm 64 years old. I'm not going to get another chance at this. If I mess it up, if I can't be the grandfather he deserves, at least I'll know I tried." David finished nursing and Sarah lifted him to her shoulder, patting his back gently until he produced a small burp that made all three adults smile despite the weight of their conversation. "He's good at that," Marcus said. "Strong lungs." "Like his grandfather," Sarah said, and Marcus looked at her in surprise. "You always had a loud voice. Mum used to say you could call the whole neighborhood to dinner." The memory seemed to surprise her, this casual reference to shared history. Marcus felt something shift in the room, a subtle warming that hadn't been there before. "Your grandmother used to say the same thing about my father," Marcus said. "Said he could holler loud enough to wake the dead when he was calling us kids in for supper." Tom stood up and stretched. "I'm going to make another pot of coffee," he said. "This feels like a long conversation kind of night." After he left for the kitchen, Sarah and Marcus sat in comfortable silence. David had fallen asleep again, and Sarah held him easily, naturally, as if she'd been doing it for years instead of days. "I kept your letters," she said suddenly. "What letters?" "The ones you sent after I moved to Seattle. I never answered them, but I kept them. All of them." Marcus felt his throat tighten. He'd written to Sarah for 3 years after she moved away, long letters trying to explain himself, to apologize, to maintain some connection. When she never responded, he'd eventually stopped, assuming she was throwing them away unread. "Why?" "Because sometimes I missed you. Sometimes I'd read them when I was lonely or scared, and I'd remember that you loved me, even if you didn't know how to show it." The admission hung between them, fragile and precious. Marcus felt tears threatening again, but this time they were different. Not the bitter tears of regret, but something softer, something that might have been hope. "I never stopped loving you, Sarah. Not for one day, not for 1 minute. I just didn't know how to love you better than I loved my job. And now? Now I'm retired. Now I have time. Now I understand that all the overtime in the world doesn't matter if you don't have family to share your life with. Sarah looked down at David, then back at Marcus. If we did this, if we tried to rebuild some kind of relationship, there would have to be rules, boundaries, whatever you need. I mean it, Dad. No broken promises. No saying you'll be here for something and then choosing work instead. David won't understand that kind of disappointment. I'm retired, Sarah. No more work to choose over family. And no showing up unannounced. No trying to override my decisions about how to raise my son. If I say no to something, that's final. Marcus nodded. Understood. And you have to understand that this is going to take time. I can't just forget 20 years of hurt because you showed up with stories about your father. I know. Sarah was quiet for a moment, looking out the window at the Seattle night. When she spoke again, her voice was soft but firm. But maybe we could start with phone calls. Once a week, maybe Sunday afternoons. You could tell me about Detroit, about the family history I never learned, and I could tell you about David, how he's growing, what he's learning. Marcus felt his heart race. It wasn't everything he'd hoped for, but it was infinitely more than he'd had when he woke up that morning. I'd like that very much. And maybe, if things go well, if you can prove that you're really different now, maybe next Christmas you could come visit. Stay in a hotel, but come for dinner. Meet David properly when he's old enough to smile at you. Christmas, Marcus repeated, as if the word were a promise he was afraid to believe. Tom returned with fresh coffee and settled back onto the couch. He looked between Marcus and Sarah, reading the shift in their body language. "Everything okay?" he asked. "We're going to try," Sarah said simply. "Take it slow, but try." Tom smiled, the kind of smile that suggested this was the outcome he'd been hoping for. "That's good. David should know his grandfather's voice, his stories. Family history matters, even when it's complicated." Marcus looked around the room, at his daughter holding his grandson, at the man who'd welcomed him into their home, despite having every reason to be suspicious, at the life they'd built together that was so much healthier than anything he'd managed to create. He thought about the flight back to Detroit tomorrow, about the empty house waiting for him, about Sunday afternoons that would now include phone calls to Seattle. It wasn't the reunion he'd dreamed of during the long flight west. Sarah wasn't throwing herself into his arms, wasn't instantly forgiving 20 years of missed moments, but she was willing to try, and that was more grace than he'd dared to hope for. "Thank you," he said, looking at all three of them, "for letting me in, for listening, for giving me a chance I probably don't deserve." "Everyone deserves a chance to do better," Tom said. "The question is what we do with those chances when we get them." David stirred in Sarah's arms, and she looked down at him with the kind of love Marcus remembered Elena having for Sarah, the kind of fierce, protective, unconditional love that would move mountains to keep a child safe. "I want him to know where he comes from," Sarah said quietly. "The good parts and the bad parts. I want him to understand that families can be broken and still find ways to heal." Marcus nodded, understanding that this was both a gift and a responsibility. He would have to earn his place in David's life, one phone call at a time, one story at a time, one kept promise at a time. Outside, Seattle settled into its late-night quiet, a city of bridges spanning water, connecting people across distances that sometimes seemed impossible to cross. Inside this small house in Ballard, 3 generations of the Williams family sat together for the first time, learning how to build a bridge of their own. Marcus Williams stood in his Detroit kitchen, the phone pressed to his ear as Sarah's voice filled the room with news of David's latest achievements. "He rolled over yesterday," she was saying, her excitement carrying clearly across the continent. From his back to his stomach, Tom was changing his diaper, and suddenly David just flipped himself over like it was nothing. "Smart boy," Marcus said, smiling as he imagined his grandson's determination. "He gets that from his mother." "You were rolling over at 4 months too. Really? I don't remember you ever telling me that." "There's a lot I never told you that I should have," Marcus admitted. "But we have time now." Through the phone, he could hear David making the happy babbling sounds that 6-month-old babies make when they're content and well-loved. Marcus had started looking forward to these Sunday calls the way he used to anticipate overtime pay, with eager anticipation and the knowledge that they were the best part of his week. "He's getting so big," Sarah continued. "Tom thinks he might start crawling soon. He gets up on his hands and knees and rocks back and forth like he's trying to figure out the mechanics. Your mother used to say you were like a little scientist, studying everything before you tried it. David sounds the same way." "Dad, I've been thinking about Christmas." Marcus felt his heart skip. They'd talked about Christmas before, about the possibility of him visiting Seattle, but Sarah had never committed to anything specific. "What about it?" "Well, Tom's parents are coming for Christmas Eve, and I thought maybe you could come for Christmas Day. David will be 8 months old by then, old enough to really interact with people, and I think I'm ready." Marcus had to sit down. After 6 months of careful phone calls, of rebuilding trust one conversation at a time, Sarah was inviting him to spend Christmas with his grandson. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. Tom found a nice hotel near us, and there's a direct flight from Detroit to Seattle. It wouldn't have to be a long visit, maybe just 3 days, but I think David should spend at least one Christmas with his grandfather." Marcus looked around his kitchen, at the photographs of Sarah that still covered the walls, at the empty chair where Eleanor used to sit, at the life he'd built in solitude. For the first time in years, Christmas felt like something to anticipate rather than endure. "I'd love that, baby. More than you know." "Good. I'll send you the hotel information and the flight times that work best. And Dad?" "Yes?" "Bring those tools, the ones that belong to your father. David's too young for them now, but maybe we could put them in his room, start telling him the stories that go with them." Marcus felt tears threaten, the good kind of tears that came with unexpected grace. "I'll bring them, and all the stories I should have told you years ago." A day after they hung up, Marcus sat in his kitchen and thought about Christmas in Seattle, about holding his grandson while snow fell outside the windows, about sharing stories of the grandfather David would never meet, but whose legacy would live on in family tales and worn tools and Sunday afternoon phone calls. He thought about his father, about the man who'd never missed a baseball game, who'd understood that showing up was the most important gift you could give someone you loved. David Williams would have approved of this second chance, would have understood that sometimes the longest journey was the one that brought you home to family. Outside, Detroit continued its daily rhythm, but inside Marcus Williams's small house, everything had changed. The silence was no longer empty but expectant, filled with the promise of Christmas mornings and grandchildren's laughter and all the moments he'd thought he'd lost forever. In Seattle, Sarah Coleman hung up the phone and looked at her son, who was lying on his back on a blanket, reaching for toys that dangled just within his grasp. David had his grandfather's determination, she realized, the same stubborn persistence that had driven Marcus to fly across the country to knock on her door. "Your grandpa's coming for Christmas," she told the baby, who responded with a gummy smile that lit up his entire face. "He's going to tell you stories about your great-grandfather, about the family you come from, and maybe this time he'll know how to stay." David gurgled happily, as if he understood that his world was about to expand in wonderful ways, that love could stretch across any distance, and that families, even broken ones, could find their way back to each other. The Christmas lights of Seattle twinkled in the distance, and Sarah Coleman smiled, finally ready to believe in the possibility of forgiveness, in the healing power of second chances, and in the enduring strength of love that survives even our worst mistakes.